behind my house lies a forest, and within that forest, there's a trail that stretches from one end to the other. I discovered this trail not long after I had moved into my house. I was lounging out in the back one day, while my dog Rex was running around the backyard. After a few moments, I realized that I could no longer hear the skittering sounds of Rex running. I sat up and looked around. Sure enough, he was gone. I called out Rex's name, and within a couple of seconds, I heard distant barking, originating from within the woods. Fearing that he may have gotten injured, I quickly jumped up from my chair and ran towards the trees. When I got close to the tree line, I noticed a break in the foliage. It was hard to see from a distance, but up close, it was unmistakable. The gap in the woods led to a much larger path, which seemed to go from east to west. I ventured onto the trail, whistling and calling for Rex. Thankfully, I found him a couple of minutes later. He was a little off the trail, having a standoff with a very cocky raccoon. I couldn't help but laugh as I realized that the raccoon was actually winning. I called Rex over to my side, and he accepted defeat. At this point, I was able to stop and admire the scenery around me. I began walking along the path with Rex by my side. The colorful leaves against the sunlight gave the entire forest a golden appearance. The sound of leaves rustling overhead as a gust of wind passed by and filled my ears. I saw Rex playfully run from one side of the path to the other, sniffing and exploring. We walked for 20 minutes before I decided it was time to head back. I called Rex and he followed along as we slowly made our way towards the house. After nearly a half hour of walking, I found a break in the tree line that led to my backyard. Ever since that day, I have taken Rex on a walk through the woods at least once a week. The walk sometimes happens on my day off from work, as I only get one a week anyway. The day always starts off with Rex waking me up, shoving me over and over again. He has become accustomed to these walks and has learned the routine. I eventually stir from my sleep and start getting ready, performing my usual morning routine, getting dressed, and eating before running some errands. When I get back from my trip into town, I change into my boots and open the back door. Rex flies out of the door at 100 miles per hour, and I follow slowly behind. Thankfully, Rex is pretty well trained by this point and has learned to wait for me before going into the woods. He stands at the gap in the trees, looking back at me until I'm close enough for him to enter. Then we spend an hour or so walking that trail, and during this time, I check my phone and answer emails while Rex plays in the leaves. We walk this trail so frequently that I know most of the surrounding area by heart. About a quarter mile to the west, the trail lets out to a small city park. To the north, through the brush, is a small creek. I only know about this because Rex one time chased a squirrel through that water. Aside from that, there wasn't much else to the north. To the east is the one that I know the least about. The path seems to extend for quite some time. Rex and I walked along the east path for hours without seeing any indication of an end. Eventually, the time would come for us to head back before it started getting dark outside. Then, a week ago, something happened in those woods that Rex and I will never forget. The day started off the same as any other. Rex playfully pushed me away, and I made my way to the bathroom. After a couple of hours getting ready, I checked on my schedule and realized that I didn't have to go into town today. So I decided that since I had all this free time, I would spend it walking with Rex instead. I put on my boots and opened the back door. Rex, of course, ran out, and I followed slowly behind. We pushed our way through the brush and into the path. I turned right, and we began walking towards the east. For the first hour, Rex ran from one side of the path to the other, just sniffing the whole time. While we may have been coming out here every week, it seemed like it was always his first time. The trail began to curve further into the woods, and before I knew it, we had reached the farthest we had ever gone in this direction. I looked down at him, and he returned a look of confused excitement. As we continue onward, I noticed that the trees on either side of us had started to become more and more densely packed together. The previously bright sunlight that scattered through the treetops began to diminish, and only an orange glow remained above. My eyes were drifting from side to side, still admiring the scenery, until I looked ahead, down the path. I noticed something wrong with Rex. He was standing a few yards away from me, completely motionless. I called out to him, but he didn't even move. I walked a bit closer and saw that he was staring at something off into the woods. I stopped a few feet away and followed his gaze. I thought it might have been a bear or some large animal that caused Rex to freeze. And then, standing a couple of yards into the woods, between a few of the trees, was a person. A woman, to be exact. She was wearing a white dress, which was contrasting against her surroundings. She had dark-colored hair that hung loosely in front of her face. At this distance, it was difficult to make out what she looked like. I walked up next to Rex and called out to the woman, asking if she was alright. My voice didn't seem to get a response. I turned my attention to Rex, and I told him that we should head back home. When I reached down to him, I could feel that he was trembling in place. He suddenly began to back away from where he was. I wasn't sure why, until I looked back up to where the woman was, and she was now very much closer to the path. Her head was lifted, and I could see her face through the strands of dark hair. I could see that her skin was a pale, bluish color. Her jaw, which seemed to be dislocated, was dangling towards her neck. Her deeply bloodshot eyes stared at me with an anger like I had never seen before. The sounds of bones snapping echoed from this woman as she raised an arm towards me. When she did this, I felt my body react, and in a flash I stood up, grabbed Rex by his collar and pulled him away from her. We both ran down that path once again. After a few minutes of running, Rex and I finally emerged from the trees into our backyard. I had never been so happy to see my house before in my life. I ended up collapsing shortly after entering my house, and I didn't wake up until noon the next day. I'm not sure who, or possibly what, that woman was. But ever since then, Rex refuses to go anywhere near our back door. And to be honest, I don't blame him. If any of you out there live near the woods, please be careful. There are things in those trees, things that you don't ever want to see for yourself. When my son Daniel first asked me to take him camping, I was a bit surprised. Until now, he had never really shown interest in such things before. So he caught me off guard so much that I jokingly accused him of being an alien. He told me the reason for his sudden interest. He said that his good friend Peter had just returned from a camping trip with his dad, and that Peter had been telling him all about the fun he and his dad had. As I was listening to his recounting, I could feel my fatherly instincts beginning to boil. There was nothing on my mind, aside from destroying Peter and his dad at their own game. So I smiled at Daniel and told him that I would take him camping as soon as I got some free time off of work. A few weeks had gone by, and I had put in for some time off from my job. During my off hours leading up to my mini vacay, I did my best to research all there was to know about camping. I had only gone camping myself a couple of times as a kid, so all the activities involved had been lost on me. There was no way I was going to let Daniel, or God forbid, Peter find out. However, during all this, my wife, Laura, decided to just take a step back and not get involved in our little adventure. I called her a coward for not committing herself to the destruction of Peter's family, but that didn't even change her stance on the matter. Eventually, the weekend had arrived. That Friday, I picked up Daniel from school and took him home. As we entered through the front door, I saw his eyes light up at all the supplies I had organized. A big tent bag was resting at his feet. Some sleeping bags were leaning against the table. Some bags of mostly s'mores and snacks were sitting near 2 fully loaded backpacks. I asked Daniel if he was ready to brave the wilderness with me, and he nodded. Once we loaded up the car, Laura told me to be careful. I know I like to joke about situations, but I promised her everything would be fine. Daniel and I both hopped into the car, and off we went. During my research on the internet, I had found a few places to camp at. Daniel had told me earlier that Peter and his dad went camping at the lakeside campgrounds, which were the closest to our town. I scoffed at such an obvious location, as if I were some campground expert. Our location would be in a forest nearly 2 hours north of our town. After answering about 1,000,000 questions and playing I Spy until images started to blur together, we finally arrived. We had pulled off the road onto a winding stretch of coarse dirt that snaked its way through the trees. Our car bounced and rattled the entire time. Another 20 minutes or so passed before we encountered a clearing. We parked the car off to the side, and Daniel looked at me excited. I asked him if he was ready, to which he nodded. We both stepped out of the car, retrieved all of our gear, and we began to walk. We walked a few meters away from the car and began to set up our campsite. After fumbling with the instructions when Daniel wasn't looking, I somehow managed to set up the tent. Even though despite my best efforts, it still had a slant on one side. I laid out our sleeping bags in the tent and told Daniel to find some sticks to get a fire going. While he was out looking, I skirted the tree line for any loose logs I could use. When we got our resources together, I began the tedious process of starting a fire from scratch. After nearly 20 minutes of trying, I stopped over to my car and retrieved a lighter. Within a few seconds, the dry brush caught the flame, and a few minutes later, we finally had a campfire going. I took a moment to appreciate the technology before I called Daniel over. We sat together, making s'mores underneath the changing sky, as the sun was beginning its descent. Around an hour after the sun set, I told Daniel it was time to sleep, and with a yawn, he nodded. I tapped the fire with my shoe a few times, and the embers began to die out. As we climbed into the tent and into our sleeping bags, Daniel and I listened to the sounds of the forest around us, the chirping of the crickets, the slight rustling of the leaves in the wind, the distant sound of some sort of coyote, and before I knew it, I was starting to drift off. My slumber seemed to last only a few seconds, as I felt something pulling my shoulder. I cracked open my tired eyes and looked around. Daniel was sitting next to me, staring at me in the dark. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me that he heard a noise outside. With me being exhausted, I told him it was most likely just an animal, and to go back to sleep. As I rolled over to my side and waited for sleep to take me, I heard it. It sounded like footsteps. 2 footsteps. If it were some type of animal, there would be some sort of noise or rhythm to it, but there wasn't. It sounded like a person walking around. 2 steps, then a stop. With a whisper, I told him I was going to take a peek out of the tent to make sure there was nothing there, and he returned a slight nod. I leaned towards the opening a little bit. Quietly, I tugged at the small zipper and peeled it away slowly, so as not to make a lot of noise. With the newly formed hole, I brought my eye up to it and looked around. With how dark it was outside and the long extinguished campfire, it was nearly impossible to see anything of note. Still, I scanned around carefully, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever had been making that noise. I thought I spotted something moving near the trees, but after blinking my eyes, it was gone. I turned back to Daniel, who was now sitting up and looking at me quietly. I told him there was nothing to worry about, and that we should just go back to sleep. As we both laid back down, I heard something that made my hair stand on end. The snapping of a twig, directly on the other side of the tent, where our heads were resting. I quietly sat back up and retrieved my flashlight from my bag. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and crawled outside. Standing up outside of the tent, I felt a chill from the cold night air wrap around me. I shivered a bit before focusing on my goal. I turned towards where I heard the noise and switched on my flashlight. The beam of light punctured the darkness, and at first, I saw nothing of note, just the grass and the outline of trees in the distance. Then, it stood up on the other side of the tent. This figure towered above our small tent, and despite me looking directly at it, I couldn't believe what I was looking at. It was human-like in appearance, its limbs longer than its torso, from the shoulders and the hips of its body. Its skin seemed smooth. It was hard to tell, but it looked like it had a huge amount of dirt covering its body. Its head was something out of a nightmare. Massive. The eyes themselves were black, but when I shined my light on them, 2 pinpoints of light within the dark eyes reflected back at me. Its mouth seemed to stretch across its face, like an exaggerated grin. My flashlight was shaking in my hand as I shivered, but this time not from the cold. After a moment passed, I heard a noise which made my heart sink to my stomach. Daniel called out to me, asking if I could see anything when his tiny voice carried out from the tent. This thing before me twitched and turned its attention to it. It seemed like it was drawn to the sound. Its face angled down towards the nylon material. Its smiling mouth began to widen. Then its lower jaw dropped nearly a foot long. A row of razor-sharp teeth lined the top and bottom of its mouth. It raised its unnaturally long arm high up into the air, and I realized then what it was gonna do. My body reacted on its own, and I reached my hands inside the tent, grabbing onto Daniel, and I pulled as hard as I could. Daniel and I came crashing to the ground as this thing assaulted and tore through our tent. Through the onslaught, I helped Daniel with my hand over his mouth as his tears began to coat my hand. We stared silently as this thing started tearing through our tent. During this, one of our bags had been sent flying towards us, crashing right next to me. Realizing it was my bag, I reached over and felt through the pockets before finding my car keys. I whispered into Daniel's ears that when I gave the signal to run to the car as fast as he could. Despite his distress, he nodded. A few moments after the creature started attacking our tent, a noise drew its attention off into the woods. It turned towards the sound, and that's when I told Daniel to run. We both rose to our feet and ran towards our car. A shriek filled the air behind us as we ran, and right before we made it, I clicked the button to unlock the doors, and we both entered the car, slamming and locking the doors behind us. I started the car, and when the lights came on, that thing was standing directly before us. An angry grin was plastered across its elongated face. I threw the car into reverse and we backed out of there. I spun the car around in the soft dirt, and we drove the trail back onto the main road, trying desperately not to crash in the process. We didn't stop driving until we made it home. The entire drive, Daniel didn't say a word. He just cried quietly in his seat, and to be honest, I was doing the same thing. Ever since that day, I have decided to never take Daniel camping again. Navajos growing up all their lives on the res hear about skinwalkers from time to time. For this reason, nearly everyone is cautious about who they trust or what kind of things they talk about, because skinwalkers are dangerous people that have the abilities of animals, yet retain the mind of a human. My mother has many tales to tell of skinwalkers. She tells us because she wants us to be aware that there are people out there that may want to hurt us or play with our minds. She sometimes tells me to assure me that there is a God and that he watches over everyone, even little Navajo children. So this true story, which happened around the 1960s, is one of them. One night, she and her 4 mothers were at home after a long day of shepherding and doing chores. My mom and her sister needed to use the bathroom before going to bed, and so they decided to go to the outhouse together. They didn't have plumbing back then, or running water, as they were living in a traditional hogan. The outhouse was far away, and they didn't want to walk there alone in the darkness, so they chose to go out together. It was very late, and the only source of light was the moonlight. As the two finally neared the outhouse, they thought they heard some faint sounds, like that of whistling. It was bird-like, but whoever was whistling was following them, and was circling the area. They held on to each other, scared by the sound, and continued on. Strange enough, the door to the outhouse was open. When people used the outhouse, they always latch or wire the door shut. As they came close enough, they saw a large black thing sitting inside. Even though they couldn't see its features, they could make out that it was human in nature. Terrified, they screamed and ran back to the hogan as fast as their legs could carry them. They could hear someone chasing them from behind and that it was gaining on them. As soon as they reached the hogan, they dashed in and slammed the door. They quickly told their other sisters what happened, and they sat in silence, waiting for something to happen. The hogan door wasn't secure. It was only an old worn-down door with no knob. It had a latch nailed to the inside of the door to keep it closed. Nothing was covering the smoke hole where the chimney rose out. It was open to the air, and you could see the night sky. The person outside began banging on the walls, making all of them huddle in the middle of the room, near the stove. There were heavy objects being thrown now, and a lot of noise. Soon, they heard it climb into the roof, and whoever it was walking back and forth, and every now and then, it would peer through the smoke hole at them, its face hidden by darkness. In pure desperation, my mom's 3 older sisters, being raised Catholic and boarding school, told her and her younger sister to get down on their knees. They began praying to God to protect them. One of them had acquired holy water from the church, and she sprinkled it near the door. All night, the skinwalker would circle the hogan, pound on the door, and make that whistling noise. But even though the hogan wasn't all that secured, that skinwalker never got to break in and hurt them. My mom never found out who tried to hurt them that night. Medicine man can hold a chant for you to see who tried to hurt you, but this was never carried out. Looking back on it now, my mom says that nobody was protecting them that night. Nobody but God, and that he kept them safe from harm's way. The skinwalkers would bother them on and off, but not once were they harmed. My family never mentioned skinwalkers or witches to me, so I know nothing about them. My grandpa died a few years ago, so my parents sent me to live with my grandma to help her around the ranch. I brought my cat along, and well, just after 2 weeks of living there, my cat went missing. I figured that he would come back, but he never did. I called him and looked for him, but nothing. So I went to put some hay behind the barn for the horses. When I saw something orange on the ground, it was the remains of my cat. I thought maybe something attacked him, maybe a coyote. So I picked it up, and I saw that there were no bones left, just skin. The outside of his fur was red and yellow, even white paint on the outside of him. I couldn't figure out what it was, so I buried him behind a hill with a little stone with his name carved on it. To be honest, I was heartbroken. My grandma said she could get me a new cat, but I didn't want a new cat. A few days later, I kept hearing the sounds of a cat outside the hogan and scratches at the door. My grandma doesn't have any other cats, so I would open the door and find nothing. Then, one day, I went to check on my cat's grave, and I digged it up to make sure he was still there. And he was gone. However, his bones were there. I just couldn't believe it. Why were his bones there? I thought I buried his skin. And that was just enough for me. Ever since I have lived there, I have experienced some of the strangest things in my life. I don't ever want to go back. I don't even want to share some of the crazy things that have happened to me. To be honest, I'm confused and scared about living there. So this is why I say that getting involved with skinwalkers is not a good idea. Just don't mess with them, and they won't mess with you. Ever since I was a child, I always loved the great outdoors. Just being surrounded by nature gave me a feeling of happiness. I'm not sure what exactly I enjoyed so much about it. Whether it was the animals, the plants, or just the quietness. But one thing was for sure, I was at home in the woods. My love for the outdoors is most likely because of my father. Every summer, he and I would load up the truck and drive 2 hours north to a cabin he'll rent for a week. We would spend the entire week fishing, cooking s'mores by a bonfire, hiking, and generally spending time with each other. It may sound cliche, but those are some of my best memories from being a kid. This tradition that my father and I had stuck with me even after I had graduated high school, and even when I got a full-time job. Every year, I would save up my vacation days, load up my truck, and make my way to a local campsite. I would bring some friends along, co-workers, or some girls I would be dating. Most of them weren't too thrilled to be alone in the woods with a guy that they had only known for a couple of months, which is actually understandable. But the few that did go with me over the years always said they had a blast. Even though I had many people go camping with me in the woods, most of the time it was just me and my best friend, Jimmy. We had grown up together, and there were a few times that my father would bring him along with us. Jimmy didn't care too much about the outdoors, but he was a firearm fanatic. He also liked to drink and enjoy bonfires as much as the next guy. So whenever that time of year rolled around and I had no one else to go with, he was always my last resort. Last year, he brought enough alcohol to subdue 3 fraternities and ended up drinking most of it by himself. He called me a few days after we had gotten home, and he told me he had the best time ever. Even though I highly doubt he even remembers the trip, he spent half the time passed out in a drunken coma in the tent, and the other half he spent shooting beer cans until they were metallic dust. Aside from my companion, I always had a good time. While he was passed out, I took a stroll through the woods, admiring the scenery. Even though I would go camping year after year, I always found myself amazed at the world around me. The trees swaying in the breeze, the animals scampering away from my noisy footsteps, the fresh air cleansing my lungs. I was having a great time. Not long after, we packed up, and by we, I mean I packed up, and we made our way home. That was the last time I truly enjoyed camping. A few weeks ago, I was getting ready for my yearly trip into the woods. I tried talking some friends into joining me. However, all of them seemed to have plans and couldn't make it. So I asked Jimmy if he would join me once again. But this time, he actually declined. He told me that his work was on his tail, and if he took any more time off, he would actually be terminated. After hearing this, I was put in the situation I had never found myself in. I know it may sound strange, but I always had someone who wanted to go with me every year. I called around, hitting up old contacts, even hitting up old friends whom I hadn't spoken to in months. All of my attempts, however, had proved fruitless. As the week was fast approaching, I resigned myself to going alone. I convinced myself that having some one-on-one time with nature would be spiritually beneficial. I'm not a spiritual person, but it made me feel better to believe that. The day had arrived, and I had gathered up everything I would need for a week of tranquility. I packed it all into the back of my pickup and hit the road. This year, I had chosen a new location to camp at. I had gone to the same old spot for many years, and I wanted to have a change of scenery. This one site had great reviews online, and was only an extra hour drive away, so I took it. When I got there, the turnoff into the woods gave me a strange feeling. The trees on either side of the road seemed to grow and fuse together at the branches, almost creating a natural dome over the road. It was as if I was driving into an endless tunnel. The further I drove, the more dense the foliage became. The thoughts of turning back and going home briefly crossed my mind when I saw a worn-down sign that read, "Campsite ahead." I sighed as I pulled up to another turnoff that led to a small clearing. The first thing I noticed when I parked was that I was the only vehicle here. The reviews had led me to believe that this place was a popular campsite for families to enjoy nature. I was thinking to myself that I must have just chosen a slow month to visit. I grabbed my pack from my truck and made my way into the woods. As I was walking, that strange feeling I felt earlier had come back. I couldn't hear the animals scampering away from me. The trees seemed static above me, almost frozen in time. The air around me felt very dense. I finally arrived at another small clearing. The trees overhead seemed apart just enough to let sunlight shine down on this area. It almost seemed like aliens were trying to beam me up. I quickly got busy setting up the tent and gathering nearby materials for a small campfire. I found a log at the edge of the clearing and dragged it over so I could have a place to sit. The day slowly transitioned to dusk, and with it came a new feeling, one of them which made me check over my shoulder at the quickly darkening woods around me. I'm not sure why I felt the need to check behind me so much, as there was no sound to be heard throughout the woods, except for the crackling of the small fire in front of me. The night quickly fell upon me, and I decided to head to bed in hopes of a better tomorrow. I crawled into my flimsy tent, zipping it up behind me. I quietly slid into my sleeping bag and lay there listening. The crackling of the fire had died down, and I was left with pure silence. The silence that shouldn't be in the middle of the woods. I lay there for 20 minutes, trying to take my mind off my surroundings. My fatigue slowly started to grow, and just as I was about to drift off to blissful sleep, I heard something. It was the snapping of a stick right next to my tent. Hearing this in the middle of the silence forced my eyes wide open. Sticks don't just snap on their own. However, what was truly bothering me was how something had gotten so close to my tent without me hearing them. I lay there, waiting, holding my breath, wondering if something was about to tear through my tent at any moment. The slowest minute I had ever experienced ticked by. Then, after what felt like an hour of laying there, I decided to shut my eyes and go to sleep. As soon as my eyes closed, I heard something that nearly gave me a heart attack. It was a fucking voice on the other side of the tent, and this voice said my name. Upon hearing this, my flight response kicked in, and I tore out of my tent into the dead of night. I quickly glanced around me and saw that I was the only one in the entire area. My anxious mind, combined with my imagination, must have just made the whole thing up. Still, I didn't want to remain in the woods any longer, so I gathered up everything including the tent and began my trek back to my truck. Just as I was about to reach my vehicle, a twig snapped right next to me. I turned, and what I saw froze me in my tracks. It's hard to describe, but I'm gonna try my best. This creature was about the same size as me, but its arms seemed too long for its body, Its knuckles seemed to just barely hang above the ground. Its skin was incredibly pale, a stark contrast against the black woods behind it. Its face was horrible, completely bald. It had no eyes, but it had a large mouth with ugly, disfigured teeth. As horrifying as that was, what really freaked me out was how it was moving. It somehow wasn't making a single sound. I was watching it take lumbering steps towards me, but with each step it took, I couldn't hear anything. It was getting closer to me. It stopped only a few feet away from me and called out my name again, almost as if it were looking for me. I fucking ran and made it to my truck and tossed my bags into the back. I never drove faster in my whole entire fucking life. I didn't stop speeding until I safely made it back home. I used to love the outdoors, but now I'm too terrified to even leave my house. I haven't been sleeping well, and I've been having some really horrible dreams lately. And I swear, on quiet nights, I can hear twigs snapping just outside of my window. So if any of you plan on going camping soon, please take someone with you. This is a rather creepy story that my grandma shared recently that might be kind of interesting to you. She did tell it in Navajo, even though she does know the English language. I think maybe it was easier for her to explain. But it was about her older sister, my other grandma, when she was alive and still living on the mountain. We're on the New Mexico side of the Navajo res. My older grandma was living alone in her one-bedroom house, a traditional Navajo hogan. She did still own a lot of sheep and goats and was in good health. She was very energetic and alert, up until her death from cancer a few years ago. Her hogan was very traditional, so it had a dirt floor with a stove in the middle of the room, with the pipe extending to a circular opening in the ceiling. With no indoor plumbing, she didn't have electricity or even lights outside. The area is surrounded by brush, pine trees, as well as beautiful red cliffs that contain red dirt. One night, she went to bed after a long day of herding sheep. She awoke to the sound of somebody walking and moving around on the roof in the middle of the night. Annoyed but a bit irritated, she said whoever it was to state their business. The voice turned out to be a man's voice. My grandma then told him to get off her roof and leave her alone. Surprisingly, he listened to her and jumped off the roof, running in a southern direction. When she woke up the next morning, my grandma went outside to look for the mysterious footprints in the field, but there were none at all. She said that apparently it was a skinwalker that had paid her a visit at night. She said it hasn't been the only encounter she's had with these kind of things. I'm a non-Native American who has lived and worked on the Navajo res as a school teacher on several different occasions. The most recent gig was from November 1997 to June of 2000. As a lifelong resident of New Mexico, I have driven hundreds of thousands of miles, with tens of thousands of those miles at night. I consider myself a very experienced nighttime driver, where I have seen just about every type of mammal and animal, both wild and domestic, that New Mexico has to offer. I have seen deer, elk, cattle, horses, sheep, dogs, cats, rabbits, mountain lions, badgers, skunks, and many others while driving at night. So when I first started working at Borrego Pass School in 1997, I was making a home visit to one of my students, Billy. He told me on that visit that their neighbor was a skinwalker. I laughed at Billy and said something like, "There is no such thing." But Billy insisted, saying that the neighbor changed into an animal and came to their house and looked into the windows. This was all very interesting to me, but I pretty much forgot about what he said. Around 1998, I started teaching night classes at Dinia College in Crown Point. I started teaching an astronomy class, that would end around 10 p.m. I would then head back home to Borrego Pass, 18 miles to the east. One night after class, about 10:15 p.m., sometime in the spring of 2000, I was driving my 1998 Ford Escort on Navajo Tribal Road 48. I was driving about 50 miles per hour because of the possibility of horses and livestock on the roadway. I always noted Biddy's house off the road at about the halfway point to my home. It was one of my waypoints. It was about this time that suddenly something weird passed from right to left in front of my car's headlights. This was the strangest creature or object that I had ever encountered on the road. It was a large, shapeless hole that did not reflect any light whatsoever. My car's headlights simply disappeared and were swallowed into the darkness of this mass. I saw no definite shape, no legs, no head, no eyes, just a shapeless black hole. I have never seen anything quite like it before or since, but whatever it was, it really creeped me out. I remember getting scared and speeding up. I started pushing the car's speed up to 65 miles per hour and got to my little duplex at Borrego Pass ASAP. I got into the apartment as quickly as I could and locked the door behind me. I then sat in the living room trying to figure out what I saw. The next day, I told one of my Navajo friends about what I saw. He was shocked, and he immediately said it was a skinwalker, but he said I had nothing to worry about, since apparently they can't harm white men. But still, it was weird. I have told this story to several Navajo people, and they have all pretty much came to the same conclusion. It was a skinwalker. Weird stuff for sure. A logical explanation says it was a black dog or a black bear. However, I'm leaning towards the possibility that it was a skinwalker. When I was 23, I had a security gig at a dairy farm in Ohio. It was a modest place, only holding a few dozen cows at any given time. My then co-worker, a 34-year-old recovering meth addict named Corey, had just been fired for letting a cow go missing on his watch. An offense that would get you fired in every sense of the word. For starters, Corey was insane. By the time we met, he was seriously addicted to all kinds of drugs, and it rendered him virtually schizophrenic. Long nights were spent with him during my training period. He would tell me about the CIA and how they were out to get him. He was convinced that they were broadcasting thoughts into his head, and that they would stop at nothing to ruin his life. More than once, I would catch him glancing over his shoulder, or peeking out of windows with a dumb look on his face, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was following him. That's the type of person that Corey was. Each of our cows had an ear tag labeled with a number. At 8 p.m., they were each to be guided into their own respective stalls and locked in for the night. Padlocks became the norm after an incident with local kids a few years earlier. In the mornings, we would have to carry around a clipboard containing each lock combination and individually release each one. It was the most annoying way to start the day, but the cows were more secure that way. That's what made Corey's story so unbelievable. He had claimed that the previous night, cow number 29 had been locked away in her stall along with the others. He told us that the only thing out of the ordinary that night was a bat stuck in the rafters that he planned to deal with in the morning. In order for his claim to be true, an intruder would have unlocked the barn with a set of keys, unlocked 29's stall with the correct combination, then reset the locks and leave undetected. Either that, or they picked up a 1,600-pound animal and leaped through a window. Considering Corey's nasty habit of abandoning his duties in order to twitch and hallucinate in the corner, a small part of me believed that some two-bit thief might have been able to get one over him. My boss, however, a 50-year-old hothead, concluded that Corey must have been involved with the cow's disappearance and kicked them to the curb. With nobody else to fill his position, My boss had offered to pay me extra for each of his duties that I could complete until we received a new hire. Naturally, I agreed. I would be heading back to school in a few weeks and needed all the money I could get. My first night back at work began normally. Since I would now be doing the work of 2 security guards, I would arrive early to get a head start on Corey's checklist. I started out by sweeping out the barn. Farmhands tried to keep the TMR in a long pile just in front of the stall door so the cows could eat throughout the night, but that shit practically painted the floor by the time I got there. Midway through, I noticed something reflective in the corner of the barn. I swept a loose bit of corn and hay over it to investigate. On the floor before me was a neon yellow ear tag, and I picked it up to examine it. 29. Next to 29's ear tag were the skeletal remains of a bat. I guess that was just another thing that Corey never got around to dealing with. I swept up the bones along with the rest of the barn. By the time I finished, it was already 8 p.m. I made my way out to the fields, and one at a time, I guided each cow to its assigned stall. I got through about 10 or so before I noticed something strange. Across the field, about 50 meters away from everything else and all the others, was a cow, alone. It faced away from me, seemingly transfixed on a nearby cornfield. Seeing a cow on its own is nothing strange, as they sometimes need personal space the same way as people do. What was strange, though, was the way that her tail stuck straight out from behind her, unwavering. She stood as if she were afraid to slip, with her feet planted far apart. Perhaps the strangest of all, her head appeared to be tilted at a 90-degree angle. I wasn't eager to tell my boss. They had already put down so many sick cows before, but losing 2 in the matter of a week might have been enough to send them over the edge. That's when I decided to save that cow for last, as I continued to guide the rest of them inside for the night. Being in charge of twice the amount of cows I was used to was time-consuming. It took me nearly an hour to round them up. By the time I locked number 36 for the night, it was 9 o'clock. I should have been making my rounds by then, especially given the circumstances. I just had that last cow to deal with. When contemplating how long it was going to take me to unlock each cow in the morning, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The only stall left empty was number 29. I shuffled to the field, and surely enough, she was there. She hadn't moved an inch since I started the process of moving them. I approached her slowly. It was surreal seeing a creature frozen in such an odd position. As I came up on her, I could hear a definite, but muffled, chittering. It was unlike any noise I had ever heard from a cow. What the fuck did you eat? I thought to myself. I whistled to the cow before approaching her to avoid scaring her. On a dime, the chittering ceased. The cow's left ear rose to face the sky and began to oscillate like the periscope of a submarine. I could tell that moving this one would be a challenge. I rubbed her back, attempting to calm her down. Bonding is key when establishing any sort of relationship with an animal. I had never interacted with 29 before, so we were unfamiliar with each other. Her skin felt bizarre, like clay with hide draped over it. I walked around to see her face. Her eyes were peeled open, darting around. Her mouth hung open and drooped to the side. I examined her left ear, searching for a place to reinsert her tag, but there was no piercing. I strapped the halter to 29's mouth and began to lead her. It was like trying to uproot a tree with a bike chain. Each tug that I gave was useless. I began to put my weight into it, but still, no luck. When I say no luck, I don't mean that 29 wouldn't follow me. I mean that her body showed zero sign of being affected by my body weight whatsoever. Cows are strong creatures, but they're not made of stone. I was perplexed. After 15 minutes of this, I decided that it was useless to continue on, with the clock ever ticking. I could no longer afford to neglect my rounds. I began to walk to the security post to collect my flashlight and get on with the night. I heard a slow trotting. I looked behind me to see that the cow had in fact moved. 29 was now facing me. Not so shy now, I wondered. I turned around and continued walking towards the gate. When I made it halfway through the field, I began to hear the trotting again. But this time, it was louder and much quicker. I smiled to myself. Wish I would have known to walk away sooner. Without turning to face the cow, I walked into the barn and began fumbling with 29's padlock. 3 left, 32 right, 23 left. As the lock clicked open, I heard the floorboards behind me creak. A slow, vocal noise turned to a sickly gurgle. I hope to God whatever you got isn't contagious, I said before spinning around. All color drained from my face as I was greeted with the sight of the 8-foot-tall beast standing before me. On its hind legs, its ears were flapping like a hummingbird's wings. Its head was cocked sideways with one eye focused on me. Its pupils seemed to grow and shrink as it scanned over my entire body. Its lower jaw slowly moved up and down as it began to vocalize again. It began to creep towards me. Its front legs were kicking as it attempted to keep balance, all the while making that same noise. I began to feel lightheaded. I grabbed 29's padlock and made a break for the door. That's when the cow began to stomp behind me. I began to hyperventilate as I sprinted. The rest of the cows were spooked, shaking and jumping around as well. I slammed the door shut and clasped the padlock. A sickening boom shook the entire wall of the barn as 29 began to claw at the door. Oh, the beast croaked before chittering once more. I backed away from the door slowly, its wooden frame bending and contorting at the sheer force behind it. Without another warning, I turned my back to the barn and ran to my car as 29 began wailing and pounding. I never ended up making any rounds that night. Instead, I started my car and left that fucking place in the rear view mirror. I didn't even tell my boss. In fact, I avoided several of his phone calls because I had nothing to say. I figured it would be best if I just quit the easy way. There are certain things in life that back you into corners. Silence forces your hand, you know. That's why I'm writing this now. I still wanted my money. A few weeks later, just before making my 2-hour drive back to college, I stopped by the farm to pick up my final check. My boss wasn't in his office on Tuesdays, so I took advantage of the situation and granted myself access with the key that I had seen him kick under the rug once or twice. After snagging my check and a few Jolly Ranchers, I got in my car and slowly began to drive away. Out of the corner of my eye, a young farmhand standing in the grazing field caught my attention. I lowered my window and said, "Hey kid, stay away from the night shift." But he didn't answer me, nor even look at me. He just continued to stare at the pile of bones before him. As I kept driving, I kept staring at him, and he wouldn't even move an inch. That's when something struck me as odd. His head was tilted sideways, similar to 29's head. I swear, I'm never going back to that farm again. Skinwalkers. Yeah, I grew up on the reservation, and we just follow little rules at night to keep ourselves safe. They are real, 100%. My entire family has seen them. I have many native friends who have family members that are actually part of the Skinwalker community. I mean, I don't know how else to phrase it. Some of these rules are no whistling at night, don't say the name out loud, don't leave windows open on a full moon. One time we had one claw and cry at the side of our house on a full moon, so this is a personal rule that not many other people follow. We also have restricted places we can't go at night because they are Navajo worshiping grounds. And for anybody who isn't Navajo, There are places you cannot visit legally because of skinwalkers, religious practices, and sacred land masses. I do want to point out that, as a side note, most of the time they just look like normal people. They're not what the media makes them out to be. There are some non-native families living in our small town, and skinwalkers are just a normal part of their life. My mother actually cared for one in the nursing home who didn't fully transition, and there were rules that she had to follow. Some of them are smearing ash on their foreheads before entering the skinwalker's room, saying a Navajo sacred prayer, and never entering alone. There's also a few wild stories from her experience when it comes to physically caring for one, but it may be too long to add here. Now, most of them look like humans, but when it's not, it's a funky long creature that can take the form of anything with one abnormal thing attached to it, like a goat with 7 legs or a dog without a nose. They want that flesh of yours. So here are more extra tips to survive them. Living in the reservation is like playing a game of what the hell was that noise every night. If someone begins to smell like their flesh is rotting, run. If someone wants to take you to the reservation, politely say no and just move to another city. Don't ever come back, and pray. Pray to whoever you believe in. If you're not religious, pray to a random god, to anybody that comes to mind. Skinwalkers are demonic creatures. But if you're ever in the woods and you hear some whistling, this is a calling sign that the skinwalker is coming after you. Last Monday, I went on a walk into the woods. I go all the time, whether it's spring or winter. I'm 18 years old. I'm not very tall, and I don't weigh much. So I'm a pretty fast runner too. Sometimes it can get really creepy out there in the woods. My mom and grandparents, they live right down the road, by the way, always told me that if I start to feel unsafe out there, I always need to leave. They never said why, but I always figured they were afraid of the coy dogs, and it never seemed that important. I did listen to them though. So Monday afternoon, maybe a bit past 4 o'clock, I left to go walking. I had been out there just 2 days before with no issues, but after walking for about half a mile, the feeling that I was being watched began. I kept walking until I came to the old logging road. It makes for a quick way around the woods, and it also connects to the road that my house and my grandparents' house are on. I was getting pretty tired of hiking through the snow-covered bushes and logs. I still felt like something was watching me, and just a few moments before, I could have swore I saw something moving around from the corner of my eye. So I decided to walk down the logging road instead. As I was walking down it, I heard the sound of chains rattling nearby, and started looking around for them. I was thinking maybe it was just chains in a tree blowing in the wind, but I couldn't find any chains, and I stopped hearing it after a second. I kept walking and was getting close to my grandparents' land when I heard the chains again. I stopped walking to look around me and to check to see if maybe it was something I was wearing, my jacket, my necklace, but it wasn't anything on me. I jumped around to double check and maybe looked really stupid, but I knew it wasn't me making the noise. I decided just to go to my grandparents' house and walk back using the actual road. But as soon as I started heading into the woods, I heard something. It sounded like my own footsteps had been in time with a second pair that were maybe about 10 feet away, which made no sense because there had been nothing there just a moment ago. I took another step and heard something step at the same time from behind me. I didn't turn around. I was too afraid, so I acted as if I was going to take another step, but I stopped my foot right above the snow. I wanted to make sure I wasn't going crazy. Behind me, whatever there was, stepped down. I heard the snow crunch, then it moved forward again, quickly. It must have known I figured out it was there. That's when I started running towards my grandparents' land, and whatever was behind me followed. It sounded humanish, and the sound of the chain started up again when it started chasing me. The thing definitely had only 2 legs, and it sounded pretty big. There's a lot of thorn bushes, small trees, and other things that stay around all year, even in the winter. When I ran between them as best as I could, it was just going right through them. I glanced behind me for a second, and all I saw was a really tall, gray, humanoid blur before I looked back in front of me. The final stretch was terrifying. I could hear heavy breathing and chains rattling just a few feet behind me the entire time, and it sounded like it was almost growling. My grandparents' dog was up in the yard near the house and started barking, but he didn't run towards me. He just stayed by the house barking. Then he ran with me to the house when I got close to him. I ran up the door and went inside. The dog came in right beside me, and I slammed the door shut. I didn't hear anything, and I looked out the window, but there wasn't anything there. The dog was leaning onto me and shaking. My grandfather came to the door from upstairs after just a few seconds, and I started crying and told him everything. He became very serious and told me, "Don't think about it. Just forget it ever happened." I tried to ask him why, but he refused to tell me anything. I tried asking my grandmother too, but she didn't say anything, and she changed the subject. When I was 13, I was on an ATV with my 2 older sisters, one 15 and the other 18. We were going to my grandma's place, which was less than 2 kilometers away from my parents' place. We were traveling through our fields, but on the way, I suggested we go around the fence so we didn't have to open the gates. It was pretty much the same road, just a bit off to the side. As we get to the middle of the field, we all noticed something sitting on top of the hill we were about to climb. We slowed to a crawl because it looked human. We thought maybe it was an animal that had fell and was stuck, or maybe it was my uncle who looked after the cattle. But this thing was sitting weird, basically like how Spider-Man perches over buildings, crouched down on top of a rock. I want to describe this thing. It was tall, skinny, and was wearing nothing. Just the body is what we could see, grayish color, and the head wasn't shaped like a human's head. It was thin and small. We were about 30 to 40 meters from this thing, and it was during the day too. As we were sitting there trying to figure out what we were seeing, this thing slowly stood up and my heart sank. Its arms were long, very long. I screamed to stop and instantly jumped from the front of the ATV to the driver, replacing my sister. As we were switching, this thing started running at us, but it was running weird. Its arms were swaying back and forth like normal runner, but because of how long the arms were, it looked weird. You would think it would run on the long arms, but it didn't, and it was running fast. I turned around and shot off straight through the field. My sisters were screaming that it was still coming, but to be honest, I could not look back at this thing, so I just said, "Don't look at it." We rounded the corner, and that's the last we saw of it. As we got home, I crashed the ATV into the deck, trying to get in as fast as we could. We were so scared my parents actually believed us. They called all the family to warn in case it was a trespasser. They said nobody saw anything or anyone in the fields after that. Alex, Jim, and I decided to go camping. We set up camp, decided to just drink and talk, and that's what we did all night. About anything and everything that came to mind. It was 3 a.m. and we were still chatting away until we heard something in the trees. Some kind of cracking sound. Could be a bird, said Jim. A big damn bird, I replied with slight confusion. Could be a monkey, joked Alex. We shared a laugh and ignored the sound and continued to talk. Another half hour had passed and the sound had completely stopped. I wonder what that was anyway, Alex said. Well, I have no clue, I replied, taking a sip of my beer. Well, I hope it's gone, because I need a piss, Jim said, standing up and heading to the trees. A few minutes passed, and Alex and I grew concerned. We best go look for him, said Alex. He sounded a little annoyed. We stood up and walked in the direction Jim went. It didn't take long to find the first drop of blood, and then the trail that led deeper into the woods. What the fuck? I said, shaking. We began shouting for him, following the trail. I was the first to see him, standing in a clearing about 10 meters away. He was facing away from us. We tried shouting, but we got no response. We walked closer, and we noticed him twitching violently. He was covered in blood and clearly beat up. I was about to say his name once again, but the word got stuck in my throat when I saw the bloody pile of meat on the floor next to him. I think Alex saw it too, as he also went silent. As if by magic, Jim turned to us, and we saw his face was literally hanging off, and underneath was pale, gray skin. We could also see a burning orange eye, and part of a wide mouth with long, sharp teeth where the skin was peeled off. Besides from this, Jim looked normal, aside from a few cuts and bruises. As we stared into the single orange eye, the thing wearing Jim's skin pushed the peeling flesh back on, and there, Jim stood, totally normal. Hey guys, let's go for a walk, he said in his normal voice. This thing also seemed to demonstrate excitement. Alex and I turned. We ran past our campsite and got straight in the car, parked about a mile from our tent. I'm not sure if this Jim followed us. I swear I could hear thumping footsteps behind Alex and I. We reached the car and jumped in, pouring sweat and heaving. I started the car faster than ever before and drove at nearly 100 miles per hour all the way back home. When we arrived and got out, I walked around the back of the car only to see scratch marks on the bumper. I shivered as I realized how close he must have been. This was over 40 years ago. Alex never quite recovered, and last I heard, he was living in a mental hospital. I was thinking I may have to join him, as I'm pretty sure I saw Jim a few weeks ago at a bar. I thought I was mad until I did some research. I would have done it sooner, but I'm an old man now, and we didn't have Google back in the day. I'm pretty sure we encountered a skinwalker, and it may have found me after 40 years, and I think it wants to finish the job. And now it's pretty strange that I keep getting letters asking to catch up from my old friend Jim. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time we could manage. Joe lived on a farm that was next to a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and we would stay in the woods all weekend. We would only come out for school. We would be out there building shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we would walk the railroad tracks out into the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we would find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we would likely be trespassing. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges no one went to. We fished. At night, we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was the best. In fact, it was so fun we did it a bunch of times and never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own separate ways. We both ended up leaving home, but we always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits, so we would see each other often. Well, one summer, in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We would do stuff with family in the day, and at night, we would catch drinks at the bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the good old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Remembering these moments and drinking beer are a hell of a mix. Soon, we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and walk home. When the day finally came, we started early in the morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot, where we used to always start, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe said that instead of walking the usual way, we should take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well. We had a map, so I gave a what the hell, and off we went. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked the joint and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and more stuff. Before the night arrived, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forest area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We also brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the area. Now, this is also something we used to do in the old days as well. We would walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill and we were actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods, and we also went up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from on top of this short hill, we would be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom. About 100 yards into the woods, it was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were standing, everything was quiet. No movement. Nothing could be seen. No lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of rot. A cross still stood on top of the place. None of the windows had glass and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside, and there were rows and a section up in the front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints. No roads. It was an abandoned church. We quickly left and went back up the hill to our spot we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods. Besides, at this point, it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on early morning. When the night came, we were laying down, and we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. "Do you hear that? What the fuck is that? It sounds like people singing." And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree. It was near pitch black, and we didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't even speak. When we got to the top, we saw a light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a conversation that boiled down to this. Can you believe this shit? The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and even though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in a different language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was there, but we only saw shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had a lot of space between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language, because we couldn't even understand a single word. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained crying that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears. Then, it finally stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get the fuck out of here, man," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walking out the doorway, all holding hands in a single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move towards us and the hill. That's when we booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our shit, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving weird, like whoever was holding them was also shaking them. We continued to run and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down, and we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and all her other friends just thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that has ever happened out in the woods. I try to live my life without too many regrets. I had highs and lows like everyone else in life, sure, but I do what I can to not worry too much about what could have happened if I made a different choice, if I maybe hadn't taken the road less traveled. Everyone makes the best decisions they can with the information they have available to them at the time. Going through all the what ifs is crazy, because the only way you would have made a different choice is if you had some other detail, which of course you didn't. You can never be exactly sure what the sequence of events might have looked like if you gone right instead of left. And yet, there is one choice I made, one road that I took, that I just can't help but wonder how things might have turned out if I had only done something different. My job has me move around pretty often. I'm not going to get into what I do. That has no bearing on the story. But a couple of years ago, I was working in Philadelphia and living on the other side of the Delaware River in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. I'm originally from northwestern Pennsylvania, and this was the closest I had been to home since I moved out of college. So I took the chance to go see my parents whenever I could. I knew I would be moving again before long, and my folks aren't getting any younger. So I try to find a weekend every month or so to make the 7-hour trip to visit them. If I had been thinking about it when I was looking for places to rent, maybe I would have tried to live on the west side of Philadelphia instead of this side in Jersey to avoid the rush hour. But by the time I realized, the lease was signed and there wasn't much I could do. The drive to my hometown was pretty boring. I would take the Ben Franklin Bridge across the river, head up I-476 for an hour or so, then a long slog across basically the entire expanse of Pennsylvania on I-80 before another hour north of I-79. The only thing about the drive was how long it would take me to get through Philly, because once I got on the 476 extension, I could predict my ETA within 5 or 10 minutes. My second summer in Jersey, I had taken 2 weeks off and planned on spending the second week back home. Things changed that first Wednesday though, because a big storm came by and knocked out power in a good part of the area where I was living. Dealing with 90-degree heat with no AC wasn't something I felt like spending the first half of my vacay doing. So after one uncomfortable sweaty night, I let my parents know that I was heading over a few days earlier. I should have left first thing in the morning, but because I had a couple of things to take care of before heading out, by the time I finally got on the road that Thursday, it was past lunchtime and getting on mid-afternoon. For whatever reason, the traffic in Philly was heavy, and by the time I finally got through town, I was a good hour behind schedule. Still, based on my timeline, I figure I'll still be able to make it early enough to grab a dinner and beer with my dad and brother before cashing in for the night. There were 2 things I hadn't taken into consideration. One was the number of other folks that, apparently, had the same idea to get out of town that I did, and that the road construction must have sprung up in the time since my last trip home. The interstate highway system is a heck of a thing. Being able to zip along at 65-70, or in some remote places like West Texas even faster than that, makes cross-country travel take a fraction of the hours it would otherwise. I can't tell you the number of times my folks always talk about the days before the interstate, when going to see friends outside of DC would take almost twice as long as it does now. What's truly remarkable to me though, is that even though the entire system of highways was built start to finish in a mere 35 years, it sure seems like when parts of it go under construction, they stay that way forever. Traffic was heavy, but moving, and I was making decent time until I saw the first orange warning signs, letting me know that 4 lanes were reducing to 3, and then 2, and then 1. There were hundreds of cones stretched down the road as far as the eye could see, and see I could as the cars in front of me reached a complete and total standstill. It was one of the worst deadlocks I had ever been in. Seriously, I think I moved about a mile in about an hour. After about 3 hours, my stomach started grumbling. With an exit just ahead and no end to the traffic jam in sight, I got off and found a diner to grab some dinner. Even if traffic picked up, I still had a solid 5 hours of driving ahead of me. So at that point, I knew for sure it was going to be pretty late that I was getting in. After finishing eating, I got back on the road. Things looked like they were picking up for a couple of miles. But then, I came up to the back end of a jam and was right back to waiting. We were moving a little bit better, I think averaging about 5 miles an hour at this point. But as the sun started edging towards the horizon, I pulled out my phone and started to see if Google could point me in any kind of workaround. It's a funny thing about human nature. Most of us don't like to sit still. Studies at airports show that people would rather walk further to baggage claim to get their luggage, even if the total time would have been less if they had a slightly longer wait at plane side. Well, the power of the internet appeared to be in my favor. Even though I-80 still showed a dark red band for another 50 miles or so, there was a southbound country road coming up a few miles, and a northbound a couple after that. Both of these roads looked like they let me bypass the worst of the traffic. Since I spent the better part of the day sitting on the road, my patience was about worn out, and I opted to take the southbound road. Even though the app told me it would take about 30 minutes longer to get to my parents' house, I just wanted to get moving again, and reasoned that at this rate, it might take me more than a 35-minute difference to get to the northbound. And that is a choice that I will remember until the day I die. I made the turnoff and felt my mood improve. The signs changed, limiting my speed between 35 and 40 miles an hour. But even that seemed like flying compared to the logjam I spent the last several hours in. The drive was interesting. The road was starting to get a little twisty, with plenty of changes, as it curved up and around the hills of central Pennsylvania. It took me on a general southwest road, but turned and doubled back on itself enough that for the first 30 minutes or so, I had views of the stalled traffic on I-80. Pretty soon after that though, just about the time that the sun was just dipping down beneath a couple of hills in my rear view mirror, the road took a long curve and carried me down and away out of sight of the interstate. Now, something that a lot of people don't know is how big of a state Pennsylvania is. There are plenty of bigger ones, but Pennsylvania is really big, and it's also remote, isolated. The translation of the name means Penn's Woods. After all, the Blair Witch Project didn't have to embellish that aspect of the state. The fact that you could head into the woods and walk for dozens of miles in any way without seeing anything like another human being was pretty creepy. It's got a decent number of big cities. Pittsburgh and Philly both have enough of a population to support major sports teams, but away from those centers of development, there's a whole lot of nothing, and trees, and dark, and lonely roads. Such was the road I was traveling that night, winding through the twists and turns of the Appalachian foothills. I moved around a lot. I mentioned I traveled through most of the states anyways. I sometimes used to wonder, when I would be driving along a patch of asphalt, surrounded by only untamed wilderness, what it must have been like to build such a road. What was it like before man had intruded with our civilization and our machines? What used to live there? But I don't wonder anymore. Not ever since that night, when I made a left instead of right. The road continued to twist back and forth, up and down. As I went deeper into the foothills, the trees grew thicker, branches from either side of the road reaching over and almost touching, forming a natural canopy 20 feet up that blocked out much of my view of the sky and the stars above. I drove with my high beams on, because the idea of streetlights had never entered the minds of whoever built this road. The painted lines were old and not well cared for. I've never been a good navigator. My parents used to say it was because when I was a kid, my nose was always pushed into a book during car rides. But I think it's because I'm just bad at it. So it was that. There was no way possible I could be lost, as there were no other roads that I could have possibly turned onto and gotten off track. I also found myself more frequently checking my phone to ensure I was still on the right path, which is how I almost ran into the other car. My mind was wandering, thinking about the fact that my signal bars had dropped and remained at 0 for the last 20 minutes, and what possible implications that would mean if I came across some kind of emergency. I raced my eyes back to the road after Google Maps confirmed for the 20th time that I was still on the right path. That's when my brain took a beat to process that I was approaching a vehicle stopped in the middle of the lane. I slammed my foot on the brake. I stopped in time, but not by much, with maybe 5 feet separating my hood from the other car's rear bumper. My heart was pounding in my chest as adrenaline coursed through my body, but my fear quickly gave way to anger. Seriously, what the hell was this guy doing? Not only was he stopped in the middle of the road, but all his lights were off. If I didn't have my high beams on, there was a good chance I wouldn't have seen him, even if I wasn't checking my phone. I could feel my heart beating in the vein on the side of my neck. I'm not somebody who struggles with road rage, and after a couple of quick seconds, I managed to get a hold of myself, not wanting to outright alarm anyone that might still be in the vehicle. I shifted into reverse and backed up about 20 feet, popping my emergency lights on. That's when I started noticing a few strange things about the stopped vehicle, more than just the fact that the lights were out. Of course, it was stopped in the middle of the road, but that wasn't unreasonable, since there wasn't any shoulder that the driver could have moved onto. The strange thing, though, was that the doors were open, those on the driver's side crossing over slightly onto the other lane. And even more was that I saw that an item was dropped out onto the road by the rear driver's side door, something that appeared to be a child's stuffed animal. I considered my options, and after a few seconds, decided that I would have to go against my better judgment to just keep on my merry way and head outside to get a better idea of what was going on. I said earlier my job doesn't have anything to do with the story, which is mostly true. But before you judge my choices, it bears mentioning that I spent some time in the military. An obligation to help people has been drilled into me over the years, and I've seen enough things while deployed to feel I could handle myself. And so I got out of my car, but kept it running. I popped the trunk to grab the flashlight I keep there and left my headlights on so I could see what I was doing. I looked up and down the road, hoping to see signs of other cars approaching, but no luck. I called up to the other car as I cautiously started my approach, circling around to the left, to the middle of the road so I'll be able to get a look inside before I got too close. Anyone there? No answer. My headlights were helping, but there were enough shadows to still hide the car's interior. Shining my flashlight, though, easily determined that no one was inside. I moved closer, stopping down by the rear door to pick up the falling object off the ground. It was a child's toy, just like I thought, a stuffed rabbit, with patches showing signs of frequent love. I frowned. If the folks traveling in the car had hitched the ride with somebody passing by, they would have taken the rabbit, or the kid would have been throwing a fit. I shut the rear door and moved up to the front. I put my hand on the hood and found it was still warm to the touch. That means it couldn't have been here too long. I slid into the driver's seat to try and figure out if there was some kind of mechanical issue that would have forced the car to stop, and was startled to find a set of keys still dangling from the ignition. Pressing the brake, I turned the key and the engine started right up. Headlights and the interior light in the roof springing to life. Fuel, oil, temperature, battery, all the gauges looked good. Not even a check engine light. Strange. Very strange. Then I saw the purse in the passenger seat. I picked it up, a normal brown shoulder bag, and briefly rummaged around before finding a wallet inside. Everything appeared to be intact. About $40 in cash, a couple credit cards, gym membership, Sam's Club card. The driver's license named the owner as Mary Walker, a pretty blonde that had just turned 30 the month before. There were a few pictures showing Mary in stage poses, sitting on a blanket under a tree. A huge, bearded lumberjack of a man hugged her from behind. A small ponytail girl with a goofy over-exaggerated smile on her lap. That's when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A shiver running down to the base of my spine. Something was very wrong with this situation. I put everything back in the purse and returned it to the seat. I turned off the car and got out, shutting the driver's door behind me. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed 911, holding it over my head to try to get a connection with no luck. Cursing softly, I jammed the red end call button and moved around to the passenger side of the car. I played my flashlight around and noticed that some of the foliage at the edge of the road was bent and trampled, like someone had walked through it. I didn't have enough woodcraft to be able to judge how long ago they might have passed, but even then, I couldn't imagine any scenario for why they would have gone wandering away. Shining my light into the woods, the beam only extended maybe 30 feet through the trees before being effectively swallowed by the greedy blackness. Looking at all the flat grass, at the stuffed rabbit in my hand, then at the dark trees crowding maliciously, my thoughts came back and forth between what I should do. I made up my mind. I had been trained to help people. It was hardwired into my system. There was a child somewhere in the woods. I raised my foot to take a step onto the path, and that's when a white flicker of movement entered the very edge of my flashlight beam. It was Mary Walker. She was naked and walking stiffly, unnaturally, her arms swaying out of sync with the rest of her body, like a puppet being manipulated by somebody who's not an experienced puppeteer. "Hello?" her voice called out. "Anyone there?" That's when more shapes came into view behind her, shambling along. Here, the bearded man who must have been Mary's husband, then their little girl, owner of the well-loved rabbit, both moving as strange as their wife and mother. And now, I could tell there were more, many more, their forms out of the direct light, but so many they caused the darkness to pitch and swell with their strange, staggering passage. Their voices a chorus. "Hello? Hello?" they called. "Anyone there?" Echoing back the questions I was asking only a few short minutes ago when I approached the abandoned car. I took a stumbling step back, away from the woods and the approaching figures. I ended up tripping onto the Walker's car, but at that moment, I shone my light up into the pitch recess of the branches, and in doing so, I could just make out, barely, a sort of darkness figure that was crouched, hidden in the upper limits, a void even darker than the trees. Was it my imagination? Those lines of pure blackness that extended from that concealed mass, that seemed to pierce the flesh of Mary Walker and her kin, and the countless other shapes moving in sync with them. That's when I sprinted back to my vehicle, engine still running. Hello? I shifted to reverse, keeping enough of my head to avoid running off the road as I completed a 3-point turn. Anyone there? I took a glance in my rearview mirror. The pale form of Mary Walker stood still just at the edge of the forest where the trees met the road. One hand was raised, signaling me to return, or perhaps waving goodbye. Her face was a mask of confused sadness. I pressed the gas and drove back the way I came. I didn't look back again. The rest of the trip was a fog. At some point after I made it back to the interstate, I called my parents. I let them know that I wouldn't be getting in until late. I drove on autopilot, the traffic jam having cleared while I was off. I thought about calling 911, but I didn't. What would I tell them, and to what end? There was no one left to be helped. I try not to go through life with too many regrets, wondering about what if. But this one, this choice, what if I had left earlier in the day? What if I hadn't stopped for dinner? Maybe I would have still gone left. Maybe I would have been there in time to help the walkers. Maybe I would have been taken by that black thing that was fishing in the darkness. What if I had gone right? Would I still be ignorant, going through life, unknowing that there are these things out there? I try not to think of it too often, but every now and then, all these thoughts turn to the stuffed rabbit. It wasn't until I reached my parents' house that night that I realized I still had that rabbit clutched in my hand. I used to wonder, before man brought our roads and civilization, what was the wilderness like? What lived there? But I don't think about these things no more. I can't afford to. At least, if I don't want to wake up screaming. There are things out there in the woods, in the darkness, in places that humans still have not ventured out to. So be careful when you're out traveling, going into these country roads, and that no matter how bad the traffic is, always stick to the interstate. This just happened a few days ago, and I'm extremely shaken up. Some backstory first. I live on the second floor of a 3-level apartment. We have a crawl space that connects all the apartments. We aren't sure why it's there, but we all have stuff in it, and none of us would ever even attempt to go inside of it, so we still felt pretty safe. The other night, the sun was going down, but it wasn't pitch black out or anything yet. I'm walking through my living room when I see a short woman on my fire escape, looking into my windows. This is extremely bizarre, considering it's still semi-light out, and she must have literally gotten onto a fire escape somehow. We have 2 windows that the fire escape reaches, and she was looking in both, but didn't see me. I crawled onto the ground and my heart was racing as I watched her try to open the windows. I didn't know what the fuck to do because my phone was in the other room. After what seemed like forever, she finally left. I went into my room to get my phone to text my landlord and call the cops. I came back into the living room and was looking out the windows to see if I could locate her, when all of a sudden, I hear a weird noise coming from the ceiling. We had one of those tile ceilings made out of separate slabs of cork or wood. I looked up to see one of the slabs lifted up, and 2 eyes were staring at me. I have no clue how she got into the crawl space so quickly, but I grabbed the nearest thing next to me, which was a broom, and started hitting her with it through the ceiling, and called the cops as soon as she crawled away. They showed up and searched the place and didn't find her until a few days later, when she was on someone else's fire escape. The cops said she was definitely on some hard drugs, and that she was very violent. I'm glad she's gone. This was the scariest experience I ever had. Imagine some crazy lady coming through the ceiling as you're laying down in bed tonight, looking up. It was a Sunday early in the morning. I live in the suburbs, but my parents own a farm that I enjoy going to because I get to see my dog. Her name is Molly. She's a mutt, but she's not a tiny dog by any means. At that time, I felt very safe around her and would often take her for walks in the forest that was nearby. The day started off like any other. Me and my dad got in the car, drove around for a while, and arrived at the farm. I got out of the car and hugged Molly. My parents always got angry when I hugged her. This was simply because I would smell like her for the rest of the day. I put a leash on her and asked my dad if I could take her for a walk. He always thought that we would just go down a road and back, but I always found it more interesting to take her to the forest. I always felt a certain kind of peace and relax there that was unmatched by anything else. So we took a turn and headed to the forest. When we got there, I would take her leash off so she could explore on her own. Most of the time I would carve my name into the trees or look for anything else interesting. I was playing baseball with some rocks and a wooden leg, most likely from an old table, and then I heard it. Molly was barking at something. This wasn't normal when we were in the forest. I thought it was a fox or some other animal, so I quickly grabbed the wooden leg like a weapon. I knew that if it was a fox, I would attack it, but I had a sense of security when I was holding it. I called out to Molly, 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 but she kept barking. This was actually very strange for me, because she always came to me when I called her. I followed the sound of her barks and stumbled across a scene that I'll never forget. There was a man, most likely in his late 50s, half naked, carrying a large machete in one hand and holding moonshine in the other. This was the first time that I stumbled across someone in the woods, especially someone half naked and carrying a big-ass machete. He was completely ignoring Molly and hacking away at the ground for some reason. I didn't really know how to handle the situation. Even now, I still don't know how I would handle it. Sir, are you okay? I said, confused. I don't think I understood the seriousness of the situation at the time. He turned around, revealing his face. He had blue eyes I had never seen to this day. I could see them so well because they were wide open. Come here, boy. Look what I dug up. I was afraid if I didn't listen to him, he would start chasing after me, and that was something I wanted to avoid at all costs. I got closer, but kept a good distance. I didn't see anything except for an empty hole. He returned to hitting the ground with his machete, occasionally taking sips from the bottle. I used this window of time to get my dog, and started walking away slowly, as to not notify him that I was leaving. But then, I took one final glance at the man, and this time, his head was dug deep in the hole. I was intrigued, so I kept looking. I know how stupid of me, but when he finally got up from the ground, I was shocked when I saw him carrying a bone in his mouth. I have no idea what animal it belonged to, if it even did belong to an animal. That's when I saw enough and started running with my dog. As we ran, I heard him laughing, and then I saw something flying from the corner of my eye. It was that damn machete. I heard him yell, "God damn it." This actually made me run even faster. I know the forest very well, so I wasn't afraid of getting lost. I went through branches and bushes until I got out of the forest. But I didn't stop running until I arrived at the garage, where my father was testing out lights on our tractor. I didn't tell him a single thing about the man, since I was afraid that he would get angry and wouldn't allow me to walk Molly anymore. Needless to say, I never, ever went to that forest alone, ever again. I've been running in these woods for as long as I can remember, but this encounter makes me change my mind. The story begins at around 6:30 p.m. I had finished eating and decided to go on a run, as I always do. I always use the same path, cross the street, run for about a mile, and pass the gate that goes into the forest. Something important to note is that the trail I used in the forest is separated about halfway through. One path is paved and the other isn't. I always go into the unpaved trail first and then turn into the paved one after about 3 miles. Nothing really ever goes wrong. I meet some people walking their dogs, but other than that I'm pretty much alone. At least, I thought I was. I had been running for a while now when I heard a notification coming from my phone. A notification from AirDrop. Since I didn't want to make it look like I was worried, I kept running for a couple of minutes and then stopped to change the music. I opened the AirDrop dreadfully. Who the hell was sending me stuff? I was pretty sure I was alone. I clicked on the drop and my heart sunk. It was a Snapchat picture of me running with the caption, "You look good." I didn't turn around. Instead, I kept running like nothing happened until I got to a certain point. You see, the forest is surrounded by a fence to stop children from coming in unsupervised. And I didn't like that rule when I was little, so my friends and I cut a hole in it. When I was aligned with that hole, I quickly turned and buried myself into the forest, aiming for my escape. I could hear something behind me, and I still didn't turn back. When I finally got to the hole, I jumped through it, and absolutely booked it to the fire station that was a couple streets down. The last thing I could hear when leaving the forest was an angry huff, and metal scraping against metal. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted from me, but I will never run in this forest again. Late at night, I go to the bathroom multiple times, but for the past 4 days, every time I go to leave, I can see myself still standing in the mirror from the corner of my eye. It's like the other me is watching me leaving the bathroom. It terrifies me to the point where I almost run out without looking directly at the mirror. I never told my husband about it because I didn't want to acknowledge it out loud. But today, I took a nap in our bed while he sat up in the chair next to it, watching TV. When I woke up, he told me that he had seen me sit up and crawl backwards to the edge of the bed and stand up in front of our bedroom door from the corner of his eye. He thought it was weird, but I got up like that because I'm in the last month of my pregnancy and I can't really move so well without it hurting. So he tried talking to me, but when I didn't answer, he said that he looked at the door to find me not there and still sleeping in bed. I got really creeped out, and I finally told him about what I had been seeing in the bathroom. He thought it was creepy as well, but didn't want to really talk about it anymore, because he thinks it will give whatever it is power or energy. I have no idea what it wants, or why we have both seen it, but if you have any idea, please let me know. Also, as you're getting ready for bed tonight, Walking out the bathroom, take a peek behind you towards the mirror and see if your own reflection is looking at you as you walk out. They say that if you come face to face with your doppelganger, it's an omen or warning of death for both you and your twin. Because of this, if you see a replica of yourself, run for your life. If you keep seeing your doppelganger, chances are that your days are numbered because you'll soon come to an end. There are many stories regarding encounters with doppelgangers, none of them pleasant. Often, a person does not actually see their own doppelganger, but someone else does. Can you be at two places at once? Well, of course not, but it's a very strange feeling when someone who knows you very well insists that they saw you just 30 minutes ago and you were nowhere in the vicinity. Imagine this happening time and time again. You'll soon go insane. The story goes that a doppelganger will precede the arrival of the real person. Many stories explaining their experiences with these things have this in common. Perhaps he's one step ahead of you. I remember one Sunday morning, my brother and I were watching TV and someone knocked on the door. We lived in an apartment that was empty. The owner hadn't rented the second floor. It was a 2-bedroom apartment with a kitchen and a bathroom by the door. A small apartment but with a big window that faces out to the door. So when I heard someone knock, I checked the window and I saw my father. So I thought. I was going to the door to open it. When I was going to unlock the door, my mother pulls me away and screams at me to not open the door because I didn't know who it was. I told her I saw my dad and she freaked out. Going to the window and then checking the peephole. She started to get terrified and she said to go to the room in the apartment and to not come out. She went and woke my dad. My dad got up angry and confused. We told him what we saw, and the man was still knocking at the door. My dad screamed, "Who is it?" No answer. He said he will call the cops, but no response. While my dad was busy screaming at him, we saw that he was just standing still in the front of the door. So my mom took us to the furthest room from the door, while my dad got ready to open the door with a metal bat. Once he did, the man was gone. My dad goes out looking everywhere around the apartment for him. The apartment door was a heavy metal door, and I always was heard when someone comes in and out, but we heard nothing that morning, and nothing when my dad opened the door. We heard no footsteps either, but my brother, my mother, and I saw that man that looked exactly like my father. Both times that my family experienced doppelgangers, the doppelgangers refused to respond when spoken to. The first was my sister's doppelganger, who my brother told to go downstairs for lunch. She didn't answer. When my brother walked downstairs, he instantly saw my actual sister wearing a different shirt. She couldn't have passed my brother so quickly because the staircase led directly to our dining area. The second was my own doppelganger, who stood at my door at 12 p.m., mute, not saying a word, and staring at my sister, who was using the computer. I wasn't actually home until 4 p.m. later that day after school. My sister didn't know that until she asked me why I was just staring at her, without emotion, and dark eyes, earlier, around noon. When I was in middle school, I was at a friend's apartment she lived in with her mom. Her mom was pretty cool and let us party there, and she was always at work for long, late hours. There was a group of us there, maybe 6 people or so. Everyone was in the living room, except for this couple who were in the mom's bedroom with the door closed and lights off. We had all gotten pretty baked. I had just made myself a snack and was walking to my friend's bedroom, which was right past the mom's room where the couple was. As I walked past the mom's bedroom door, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the door opening from the inside, and a partial head of what looked identical to my friend's mom, who obviously wasn't at home at the time. I didn't think anything of it since there were so many people in the small apartment, and kept walking and sat in my friend's room. A minute later, the girl who had been screwing around in that bedroom came out and yelled at me and asked me why I had kicked the door open. I told her I saw someone come out of there, and she was adamant that I had walked by and kicked the door open. The more I thought about it, the more weird it was. I thought she was messing with me at first, but the person I saw didn't look like anyone that was there at the time. It looked so much like the mom. If it were her, it would have meant that she had somehow snuck back into the apartment after being gone for hours, hiding in her room in the dark for over an hour while this couple was messing around in her bed. And then she would have had to discreetly left the bedroom and passed the living room full of people to get to the front door. I always thought it was maybe a ghost, but now that I've seen so many stories like this, I'm thinking maybe a doppelganger. I stopped hanging out over there the next year or so I don't know if anything else weird like that happened again. So this happened in December or late November 2020. I was a few minutes late for college and my mom was with me. However, when I arrived, the fire alarm had gone off and everyone from the main building had been evacuated. I didn't know if my building had evacuated, so I went across the road and in the main entrance to ask a staff member what was going on. He told me it was just the main building that had been evacuated and not mine, so I went upstairs and went to my class. Later on, I spoke to my mom and couldn't remember if she messaged me or she told me this when she met me after college, but she asked me where I went at the start of the day. I asked what she meant, and she said she saw me walking outside towards another building instead of going to class. She said they had the same bag, clothes, hair, height, that he was identical. I told her I went to class, and she didn't really believe me at first, but I know I went to class and eventually she ended up believing me. She most likely thinks it was just some strange look-alike, but she doesn't know about doppelgangers and mimics, and after reading some stories on here and other paranormal stories, I'm pretty sure it was something paranormal my mom saw. To make it scarier, I knew from folklore that seeing a doppelganger of yourself most likely means that you're going to die. However, I didn't know what it meant if someone else had seen your doppelganger. So I looked it up, and it means that the person the doppelganger was impersonating is or will become very ill. I had health issues all my life, but never anything serious like a disease, and didn't have any that I knew of at the time. However, just a week ago, I found out that I have gum disease, and it had been causing me to feel nauseous. I even had to go to an emergency appointment to my local dentist. I know that gum disease is due to natural causes. However, the fact that my mom saw the doppelganger meant that I was going to be ill is just too much of a coincidence. Because of my OCD, I do see hallucinations, and if I had seen it myself, I would think I was just hallucinating. However, because my mom saw it, I believe her because she doesn't have a mental illness. She doesn't do drugs and hasn't smoked in over 20 years. She also wasn't drunk, and is not the type of person to make something up.